Hi and welcome to a new video. In this case I used the occlusal stem technique on the lower second molar and a freehand layering technique on the lower first molar. Let's get started. Of course, the first step is to create your occlusal stamp. You can create a stamp using a blockout resin and placing a microbrush on top in order to create an exact copy of the occlusal morphology. If you would like to learn more about this technique, I advise you to watch my previous video about the occlusal stamp technique. Once you've created your stamp and you have a really precise copy of the occlusal morphology, you can start with the preparation of the tooth. In this case, it's only a small lesion located in the fissures, so I use a small diamond burr to open up the fissures. After my initial preparation, I can use caries detector to see which spots I need to clean a bit more. I use my small diamond burr again to clean up those spots that were highlighted using the caries detector. After that, I can switch to a really small carbide burr to clean up the dentin a little bit more. I like to use this with low rotation and no water so I can actually see what I'm doing. I'm now happy with this preparation and I can continue on to the lower first molar. There's a big composite restoration which I need to remove. First, I use a bigger and rough diamond burr to remove most of the composite, and then I use a carbide burr with low rotation and low pressure to remove the remnants of composite. My assistant is occasionally applying some water to cool the tooth and the burr. The preparation phase is now finished and we can continue on to the restorative phase, which I always start with using aerobrasion. I really like to use the AquaCare to get a really clean surface to bond to. Since I use OptiBond FL, which is a total etch system, I need to etch both the dentin and the enamel. I then place my primer and my bonding and I can light cure. My first step when doing composite restorations is to always apply a thin layer of flowable to even out the surface and make sure that all of the prepped dentin is completely covered with both bonding and a thin layer of flowable. This is also known as IDS or immediate dentin sealing, which is an amazing technique to increase your bond strength, especially when you're doing indirect restorations. To even out the surface even more, but also to get a more natural color of the tooth, I like to use a dentin shade type of composite as a first layer in my preparation. In this case, I use an A3.5 color just to make sure that I get a really nice even layer of dentin shade. I really like to use a microbrush in a tapping motion to get a super smooth surface. Once the first molar is finished, I can continue on to the second molar, and I repeat the same process here. Now it's time to apply my second layer, which will be an enamel shade, in this case an A2. I use an instrument to press the composite down onto the tooth. I use a little bit too much and then I remove most of the excess. In the next step, I place the stamp onto the tooth and I use an instrument to really press it down. I can then remove the stamp and remove small amounts of excess that I might have. I then use a brush to make a super smooth transition between the tooth and the composite, and I can light cure. This was quite simple and really time efficient. Now we move over to the more difficult part, the layering of the lower first molar. Since layering can be quite difficult, especially to get a good morphology, I always advise to break it down into smaller parts. Let's take a look at what a lower first molar should look like. On the left side of the screen you can see a sketch of a lower first molar. And if we divide it into 4, we can roughly see how big each cusp should be. We can divide the lower first molar in 2 lingual cusps, the distolingual and the mesiolingual cusp, and 3 buccal cusps, the mesial buccal, the mid buccal, and the distobuccal cusp. And this is also the order in which I restore the lower first molar. Since the mesiolingual and the distolingual cusps are around the same size, it's pretty easy to start with these first. You can just use the lingual part, divide it into 2 and create 2 equal cusps. When I work with composite, I always use an instrument to condense the material, make sure there are no air bubbles or voids. I then use a special instrument like the Fissure to create the fissures and create a nice morphology and cusp on the tooth. And the final thing that I use is a brush to make sure that everything is super smooth and we get a really clean transition between the tooth and the composite. So let's go back to the anatomy. When we take a closer look at the buccal side, we can see that the mesial buccal cusp is around half of the entire buccal side. So this is also quite easy. Just use half of the buccal side to create the mesial buccal cusp. Once that's done, you've already restored 75% of the entire occlusal surface. The next step is the mid-buccal cusp. And if you take a closer look at the tooth, you can usually see a small indentation on the distal buccal side of the tooth. You can see the arrow pointing to that fissure. So your mid-buccal cusp should be located between the central buccal fissure and that distal buccal notch or fissure. In the next step, we can fill up the part that's left on the distal buccal side, and this will become your third cusp or the distal buccal cusp. To shape the composite, we can use our Fissure again and then use a brush to blend it all in. In most cases, we see that we still have some small areas that are unfilled on the mesial and on the distal part of the tooth. Those are the gray parts on the sketch of the morphology. The restorations are now finished, but to get a more natural appearance of our composite, we can also highlight the fissures a little bit. For the fissure characterization, we use like a dark brown type of flowable. We put a small drop in the fissure of the tooth, and then we can use our thin instrument, the Fissure, to spread it out evenly across the fissure. As you can see, it's a little bit too much, so we can then use a micro brush and our regular brush just to soak it up a little bit. I don't advise you to wipe that much, because if you start wiping a lot, you will smear it everywhere. So I would rather use like a tapping motion and let the hairs of the micro brush and your regular brush just soak it up a little bit. With fissure characterization, less is more. So the more subtle you are, the more natural the end result will be. Then it's time for a final light cure with glycerin, and then we can move on to the polishing process. I really like using the Eve polishes. With the Eve polishes, you can use the first polisher, the purple one, to get a nice finish of your composite restoration, and then you can use the gray one to get a super high gloss. And this is already the end of the video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and follow for more content. See you in the next video.